Hello and welcome to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast. If you'd like to become a patron of the podcast, we would love you to. And you can do so at patreon.com/the History Network. Thanks to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. The HistoryNetwork.org podcast, Season 37, Episode 10. Soccer Pitch Invasion, the Vienna Battlefield Discovery, and the Battle of Carnuntum, AD 170. This episode was written by Murray Dahm. Murray is an ancient and medieval military historian from New Zealand living in Australia. He has written more than 100 articles on various aspects of ancient and medieval military history, as well as other historical topics from all periods, ranging from the history of opera to the runic alphabet and recipients of the Victoria Cross. He is the author of Macedonian Phalangite versus Persian Warrior, Athenian Hoplite versus Spartan Hoplite, and Leuctra 371 BC, all from Osprey Publishing. He is, of course, a regular writer on here and a regular on the Ancient Warfare podcast. In late October 2024, under a Vienna sports field, Ostbahn-XI-Platz on the Danube, in the Simmering district, a site of ancient mass burial was discovered. 129 bodies were discovered. Intermixed bones may mean there were up to 150 bodies buried, all male, mostly between 20 and 30 years old, and all roughly 1.7 meters tall, many with wounds consistent with ancient battle. Many skeletons had injuries to their skulls, torsos, and pelvises. The radiocarbon dating of the remains puts them in the range from AD 80 to AD 234. Finds included an iron pugio, dagger, spear points, scales from suits of scale armour, lorica, squamata, and the cheek piece of a helmet. Near the foot of one skeleton, archaeologists discovered shoe nails that came from distinctive Roman legionary caligae. These works were carried out by the Vienna City Archaeology Department in cooperation with the archaeological service provider Novetus GmbH. Initial results were presented at the Wien Museum in early April 2025. The wounds on the remains were consistent with those from weapons like spears, daggers, swords, and projectiles from ranged weapons. The find would be the first direct evidence of a battle on the Danube limes. All this suggests that the dead were not executed, but had perished in battle and were buried hurriedly thereafter. The site measures approximately 5 by 4.5 meters, with a depth of up to 0.5 meters, and the deposit reflected a hasty burial as opposed to an organized interment. Most skeletons were haphazardly and abnormally placed, with limbs entangled and bodies piled on top of each other. The individuals were buried without any discernible order or orientation. Many of the bodies were found lying on their stomachs or sides, with limbs intertwined, all of which suggests hasty disposal following a large conflict. Initial reports suggested that the finds dated to the earliest period of the radiocarbon dating, during the reign of Domitian, who had fought wars in Germania and Dacia 82 to 92, or perhaps Trajan, who fought in Dacia AD 101 to 106. The pugio decorations also seem to support such a date. At least it is consistent with a dagger produced in the late 1st or early 2nd century AD. This early date would link the finds to the foundation of Vindobona, the Roman fortress upon which Vienna was later built. The find site is less than 7 kilometers from the remains of Vindobona. We are unsure of Vindobona's foundation, although it is usually dated to around AD 97. Vindobona, however, is not known to have been involved in the fighting during the wars of either Domitian or Trajan. Troops from its garrison may have been seconded for the campaigns. It would seem peculiar to use the find of a mass grave of Roman bodies with the foundation of a Roman fort, especially one where the bodies were not cared for in their interment. Such a mass grave and hasty burial is also more suggestive of a Roman defeat. Throughout the period, no mass casualty event, battle or defeat in the region is known, save one, the Battle of Carnuntum in AD 170. Fought during Marcus Aurelius's Marcomannic Wars, AD 165 to 180. As such, it may be to explore that little-known battle and interrogate whether it can relate to the Simmering discovery. Carnuntum, near modern Petronell Carnuntum and Bad Deutsch-Altenburg, Austria, 44 kilometers east of Vienna, Vindobona, was established as a Roman fortress much earlier in AD 6, when the future Emperor Tiberius established it as a fortress for his troops during his campaigns against the Marcomannic king Maroboduus. Carnuntum then became the permanent base for several regions. Legio XV Apollinaris was based at Carnuntum from around AD 14 until the AD 60s, when it was dispatched to the east to Syria under Nero in AD 61 or 62, and subsequently used in Vespasian's Judean campaign, AD 67 to 69. The Legio X Gemina was stationed at Carnuntum in AD 63, but was sent back to Hispania under Galba in 68 or 69. Galba replaced 10 Gemina at Carnuntum with Legio 7 Gemina. It stayed there until AD 71, when 15 Apollinaris returned from the east to rebuild the fortress in stone. In AD 114-115, 15 Apollinaris was again sent to the east, and from that time, perhaps as late as 117-118, Carnuntum became the permanent base of Legio 14 Gemina Marcia Victrix, which would remain there into the 5th century AD. By contrast, we know less of the garrison of Vindobona. The initial camp may have been built by Legio 13 Gemina in around AD 97, but this legion was then used in Trajan's Dacian wars to the east from AD 1110. They were replaced at Vindobona by Legio 14 Gemina, although that legion is also associated permanently with Carnuntum from AD 114. That year, Legio 10 Gemina replaced 14 Gemina and stayed in Vindobona until the 5th century. 10 Gemina had stayed only briefly in Hispania. Thereafter it was sent to Oppidum, modern Nijmegen, the Netherlands, from AD 71 until 103. It was then transferred to Aquincum, modern Budapest, Hungary, before being sent to Vindobona in AD 114. If any finds from the Simmering sports field reveal the name of the legion or legions the remains are from, this might cement the dating of the finds. Although, as this brief excursus shows, there are still potential complications. If a find is made from Legio 10 Gemina or 14 Gemina, It could be from either Carnuntum or Vindobona, and from a range of dates. The Battle of Carnuntum. The brother emperors Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus came to power in March AD 161, as soon as he was announced as Antoninus Pius's successor. Marcus declared his adopted brother Lucius as his co-emperor. This fact and several others give the lie to the oft-claimed rivalry and distrust between the brothers, where Marcus was the good emperor and Lucius was the bad one. This picture is very much a literary trope which continues to this day, but one with very little evidence to support it. Although 8 years younger, Lucius was viewed by his older brother as an equal partner whom he trusted implicitly. As so often happened in Roman history, the change of emperor in 161 was seen as an opportunity by various groups, both within and on the borders of Roman territory, to revolt, plunder, or take their charge to break away from Roman control and influence. Several of these revolts and invasions may in fact have been long in the planning, and the potentially destabilizing moment of the change of ruler was taken as the opportunity to launch. That said, however, the Scriptores Historiae Augustae (SHA) states that the cause of these invasions was the tribes had been driven on by more distant barbarians and had retreated before them. SHA Marcus 14.1. This was certainly a cause in common with later barbarian invasions of the Roman Empire. Under Marcus and Lucius, the empire was almost immediately beset by a series of military crises. In Britain there was a revolt, the Parthians invaded Armenia, and the Germanic tribes of the Chatti and the Chauci invaded Germania Superior and Rhaetia. Subordinate commanders were dispatched to Britain, while Verus himself was dispatched to lead the response to the Parthian invasion. The invasions by the Chatti and Chauci continued until 165, but were not considered the priority of the Romans, since several garrisons on the Rhine and Danube were weakened by sending troops to fight in the Parthian War. These may have been only raids for plunder, and so were not seen as a greater threat in the way the revolt in Britain or the invasion in Armenia were. Compounding the problem was the fact that denuding the German and Dacian frontier of troops made those regions even more tempting to tribes across the rivers, especially the Germanic Marcomanni and Quadi, as well as the Sarmatian Lazyges. The German frontier, therefore, would eventually require greater effort, 15 years of almost continuous war. The Bellum Germanicum et Sarmaticum, German and Sarmatian War, would occupy Marcus Aurelius and his subordinate commanders until 180, when the emperor would die, still on campaign, at Vindobona. Britain was dealt with quickly, and Verus was victorious in the Parthian War in AD 165. He celebrated a triumph in October 166. The legions and vexillations seconded for the Parthian campaign would, however, take some 13 months to return to their home bases. They also brought back with them a plague, which would cause chaos throughout the empire. This was the Antonine Plague, or Plague of Galen, one of the most devastating epidemics of the ancient world, and one which may have claimed the lives of up to 10% of the population. New incursions across the Danube were already occurring against those weakened garrisons. The Langobardi, 6,000 of them according to Cassius Dio, and Obii tribes invaded Pannonia in AD 166 or 167. This invasion was repulsed, and a peace was arranged using the Marcomannic king Balomar or Balomarius as a go-between. There were 10 other chiefs, one for each nation, telling us the extent of the alliance. If it was 6,000 men per tribe, then it was a significant invasion. At the time, or soon after, the Lacringi also invaded, and a tribe of the Vandals, the Astingi, together with the Lazyges, invaded Dacia. This invasion succeeded in defeating the Roman garrison and perhaps killing the governor, Calpurnius Agricola. Probably in the spring of 168, 2 new legions were raised, Legio II Pia and Legio III Concordia. These were later renamed II Italica and III Italica. With these, both emperors advanced to Aquileia, near modern-day Trieste, Italy, spending the winter there to prepare for an expedition. It is unclear if this was to be to the north or the east, probably the latter. Another invasion, this time by the Marcomanni and the Victuali, or Victoheli, invaded Pannonia. The SHA Marcus 21.6-8 and other sources, Eutropius Breviarium 812, Orosius History Against the Pagans 7.15.5-6, tell us that there was a manpower shortage which the emperor sought to address, not only by raising the 2 new legions, but he also recruited slaves, gladiators, and even bandits into the empire's armies. In the wars to come, he would even field units of Germanic auxiliaries against Germanic enemies, in contravention of the usual practice of avoiding making men fight those with whom they might have a tribal affinity. This all tells of the severity of the crisis facing Marcus and Lucius. In January or February 169, however, the emperors were returning to Rome to deal with the effects of the plague, but Lucius Verus died at the age of 38 from a stroke of apoplexy while riding in the carriage with his brother, SHA Marcus 14.7. He may have been a victim of the plague his own army had brought back from the east. Marcus Aurelius was, therefore, left to conduct the war alone. He continued to Rome to bury his brother and deify him, and then set out later in the year intending to subdue the Lazyges. They, however, defeated the governor of Moesia Inferior, and even more tribes took the opportunity to invade Germania Superior. In late 169 or early 170, Balomar betrayed the trust the Romans had placed in him and formed a coalition of tribes, and with them he invaded and ravaged Pannonia and Noricum, defeating the garrison Legio XIV Gemina Martia Victrix near Carnuntum, and then moved on to invade Italy, sacking Opiturgium, modern-day Uderzo, Italy, and putting Aquileia itself under siege. This would be the first invasion of Italy in almost 300 years, since the time of Caius Marius in the late 2nd century BC. There may have been yet another invasion at the time too, by the Costoboci, who ravaged the Balkans and reached the provinces of Mysia, Macedonia, and even Achaia, getting as far as Athens itself. There were other aspects to the crisis as well. At some time during 169, the governor of Dacia, Calpurnius Agricola, died. We are unsure if this was a result of plague or enemy action by the governor of the neighbouring province, Mysia Superior, Claudius Fronto, who took over governing part of Dacia. Later in the year, or in 170, Fronto took over command of the whole of Dacia, but he too would die later that year, fighting the invaders. His grave, which survives, tells us that after several successful battles against Germans and Lazages, he fell fighting for the state to the last. CIL 6.41142. Probably in late summer 170, perhaps even in September, Marcus's 7-year-old son, Annius Verus, also died after a surgery to remove a tumour. The emperor grieved for only 5 days before the unfolding military crisis demanded his attention, and he headed north from Rome. Most of our surviving sources for the wars of Marcus Aurelius are poor, existing either only in fragments or summaries, or they don't tell us much to begin with. As such, the exact chronology and sequence of events is difficult to disentangle. There are even alternate chronologies for the entire period of Marcus's wars. The epitome of Cassius Dio in either book 71 or 72, we are not sure which, gives us the summary that the emperor himself fought for a long time, almost his entire life, one might say, with the barbarians in the region of the Ister, with both the Lazages and the Marcomanni, one after the other, using Pannonia as his base. 71 or 72 3.1. Herodian's summary 1.2.5 is even more brief. Any detail of particular engagements is brief indeed. Sometimes we get notable anecdotes, especially in the excerpts made of Cassius Dio's 71st or 72nd book, but they are collected without any strict chronological order. Nonetheless, they are often all we have. We also have the remarkable survival of the column of Marcus Aurelius in Rome, which shows seemingly specific incidents from across the wars. Opinion is divided, however, as to whether the column can be used to create a specific narrative of the wars, or if it, too, is an unchronological jumble of incidents. This makes the survival and insights provided by Lucian of Samosata in his Alexander the False Prophet, examined below, all the more remarkable. We do not know why Legio X Gemina, based at Vindobona, is not mentioned in these accounts. They may have been seconded to Verus's Parthian war, and perhaps had not returned to their base in full strength, or that it was regarded that Legio XIV at Carnuntum suffered greater losses, and it was therefore after them the defeat was remembered. The ancient name for the battle is not recorded, however, so it may have related to the area more widely. The general location, however, is relatively clear, unlike the sites of many of the battles of Marcus's wars which remain unidentified. That is the area around Carnuntum, and so the Simmering find, only 40-odd kilometres to the west, can easily be considered as within the general location of the battle. The Syrian satirist Lucian of Samosata lived during the reigns of 3, perhaps 4, Roman emperors in the 2nd century AD, and at the height of the Second Sophistic, when all things Greek were embraced by the Roman Empire. From Samosata, now Samsat, Adiyaman province, southeastern Turkey, on the upper Euphrates, the capital of the small province of Commagene on the border of Cilicia and Syria, Lucian became a famous satirist who circulated at the highest circles of the imperial court. The dates of his life are not known securely, but are usually given as circa AD 120 to circa 190, although he may have been born around 125 and died not long after 180. He calls himself a Syrian, but may not have been a native of the region. He accompanied Lucius Verus on the emperor's Parthian campaign, AD 162 to 165, and Lucian contributed several works to the literary environment which surrounded the emperor. More than 80 works have survived as from the pen of Lucian, and it is a sign of his great success and popularity that several of them were probably not by him at all, but put about as by him by contemporary forgers. Likewise, the fact that there are more than 150 manuscripts of Lucian's works is a testament to their ongoing popularity. Few of his works can be dated with any particular accuracy, however. Those made during the Parthian campaign are the exception. One of the most unusual of Lucian's works, and one which grants us unexpected insights into Marcus Aurelius's wars against the Marcomanni and the Sarmatians, is his life of Alexander of Abonotichus, modern-day Inebulu, Turkey, also known as Alexander the Paphlagonian, who was the founder of an important cult and oracle dedicated to the serpent god Glykon at the time. The cult became immensely popular, but Lucian exposes it as a complete sham, and Alexander himself as an utterly untrustworthy charlatan. It is the defeat of the legion at Carnuntum for which Lucian provides the most unexpected insights. What is more, his account may suggest that the defeat was far worse than our other sources let on. Indeed, the defeat and its scope is glossed over or omitted entirely by our other sources. The find at Simmering may offer remarkable corroboration of the scope of the disaster as suggested by Lucian, but glossed over or omitted in the other sources. We do not know precisely when in 170 the invasion across the Danube occurred. Usually such invasions were undertaken early in the year when the Danube was frozen, but in this case it may have happened much later in the year, perhaps even after Marcus had left Italy, in September perhaps, heading towards Dacia to defeat the Lazyges. It may even be the case that the Marcomanni knew of his departure from Italy. They would certainly have known of Verus's death. Likewise, we know little detail of the defeat near Carnuntum. Lucian, however, and probably inadvertently, provides additional detail and corroboration for these and several other aspects of the war. As part of Marcus Aurelius's measures to combat the ongoing plague, which included purifying the city, known as a lustration ceremony, and as part of his ongoing measures to ensure the purity of the army, Alexander of Abonotichus was summoned to Rome from the east and was, according to Lucian, dispatched with the army towards Pannonia. No doubt many in the army had become followers of Alexander during their campaigns in the east under Verus, and they now agitated to have him with them on the Danube. Legio XIV Gemina, stationed at Carnuntum in Pannonia, had indeed fought in Lucius Verus's Parthian war. Alexander's most powerful supporter was the elderly senator Publius Mummius Sisenna Rutilianus. Rutilianus had been consul in 146 and reached the pinnacle of a senatorial career in AD 160, when he was appointed proconsul Asii. It was usual that a senator would retire after such an appointment. In that office, however, he became a fervent convert to Alexander's teachings, Lucian Alexander the False Prophet 30. Although in his 60s, Rutilianus even married Alexander's daughter, and Lucian tells us that he personally thwarted an attempt by Alexander to murder Rutilianus. His wife, Alexander's daughter, would inherit Rutilianus's estate, but he went unrewarded for this service. Back at Rome, Rutilianus's support of Alexander continued unabated, and this gave Alexander access to the imperial court. At the outbreak of the Northern Wars, just as Marcus was about to engage with the Marcomanni and Quadi, and taken advantage of the multiple fears at Rome of both the plague and enemy activity, and which had prompted Marcus to enroll the adherents of several regions, Alexander pronounced an oracle, Alexander the False Prophet 48, which reads, "To rolling Ister, swollen with heaven's rain, of Sibyllian thralls those mountain beasts, fling you a pair, therewith all flowers and herbs, of savour sweet, that Indian air does breed, hence victory and fame, and lovely peace." This oracle stated that to guarantee victory 2 lions should be flung alive into the Danube, along with sacred herbs and spices. Lucian continues that these directions were precisely followed. The lions swam across to the enemy's bank, where they were clubbed to death by the barbarians, who took them for dogs, or a new kind of wolf, and our forces immediately after met with a severe defeat, losing some 20,000 men in one engagement. This was followed by the Aquileian incident, in the course of which the city was nearly lost. This is the most detail we get of the defeat and wider action in the campaign across all our surviving sources. Alexander made the excuse that Glycon had foretold a victory, but not which side would be victor. This recalled the oracles from Delphi and Amphiaraus at Oropos made to the Lydian king Croesus in 546 BC, Herodotus 1.53.13, as well as several other oracles where an entirely ambiguous answer was given to a question, and usually one which turned out to be read in the opposite way to which events turned out. Croesus asked if he should attack Persia, and was told that if he did, he would destroy a great empire. He attacked and was defeated, realizing too late that the great empire he had destroyed was his own. Lucian's details, however, tell us much more. They imply that the river Danube was not frozen or even especially cold, although how the barbarians subsequently crossed it is not recorded. Presumably they used boats, which a reduced garrison in the region could do, nothing to combat or prevent. This detail suggests an invasion much later in the year than is usually presumed. We can rightfully suspect that our other sources have suppressed the defeat and the loss of 20,000 men, the equivalent of all the 4 legions, or 2 and an equal number of auxiliaries. These losses probably included men from the 14 Gemina at Carnuntum, perhaps the 10 Gemina at Vindobona too, and some 10,000 auxiliaries and vexellations. If these were the losses, however, the actual Roman force involved was probably greater still. No legion was disbanded in the aftermath of the defeat. The Aquileian incident refers to the Marcomanni and Quadi placing that city under siege after their victory at Carnuntum. The defeat there opened the way into Italy, and Aquileia was 500 kilometers from Carnuntum. The invaders also sacked Operturgium, not mentioned by Lucian, although recorded by others. Corroboration of the account in Lucian even comes from a much later source. The historian Ammianus Marcellinus, writing in the AD 390s, mentions the sieges of both Aquileia and Operturgium when referring to the Quadi. He states that the Quadi, who had long been quiet, were suddenly aroused to an outbreak. They are a nation now not greatly to be feared, but were formerly immensely warlike and powerful, as is shown by their swift and sudden swoops in former times, their siege of Aquileia in company with the Marcomanni, the destruction of Operturgium, and many other bloody deeds performed in rapid campaigns, so that when they broke through the Julian Alps, the Emperor Marcus Pius, of whom we have previously written, could with difficulty check them. 29.6.1. The earlier book Ammianus refers to, where he dealt with the wars of Marcus Aurelius in more detail, is unfortunately entirely lost. If there were any other communities sacked along the way, which there surely were, we do not hear any details. The significance of an invasion of Italy by the Quadi and Marcomanni cannot be overestimated. The last time foreign barbarians had invaded Italy itself had been in the late 2nd century BC, when the Cimbri and Teutones had defeated several armies before being vanquished by Caius Marius in 102 and 101 BC. Burley, Van Ackeren, 2012-224, considered that the forces which invaded Italy must have outflanked the main Roman forces which were defeated. Carnuntum lies on the southern bank of the Danube, and so the Marcomanni or Quadi may have crossed above or below it. There are many places where a crossing could have been effected, catching the garrison off guard. This would seem more likely than that the tribes marched on Carnuntum itself, suggested by Eliot, 2020-108. Although they did prove capable of besieging cities during the same invasion, it is still more likely that they invaded intending to raid and pillage the provinces, even Italy, rather than seek direct and immediate confrontation with the garrison. This would be true especially if the Germanic leaders knew Marcus and the army he led was absent further to the east in Pannonia or Maesia. The Roman garrison and additional troops may have moved out of Carnuntum and perhaps Vindobona in an attempt to check the incursion of the Marcomanni and their allies. There may have been multiple crossing points and smaller detachments sent to each. They were then surrounded and defeated, and the Simmering find may give us insights into one such location. If this was the case, then the tribes may have crossed the Danube both upstream and downstream from the site of Carnuntum, but perhaps close enough for it to provide the name of the battle. If the garrison moved to oppose the crossing of the Danube, then the find in the Simmering sports field may provide graphic evidence of a place where the Roman forces opposed the invasion and were defeated. If the garrison units split up into smaller detachments and attempted to oppose the crossings at multiple points, this too may explain why they were so unsuccessful, evidence of which is suggested in the new discovery in Simmering. Presumably the hasty burial at Simmering occurred after the tribes had moved on towards Aquileia and Operturgium, perhaps made by locals or survivors fearful that other crossings might be made in the wake of the victorious tribesmen. Perhaps the victorious tribes stayed in the local area to plunder and pillage. This too would explain the hasty burial. It is possible that the men who moved on to Aquileia and Operturgium were a separate force from those who bested the men at Carnuntum/Vindobona. This would imply vast numbers of tribesmen and women crossing over. Dio gives us the detail of women in armour, 7172.3.2. No source gives us numbers of the tribesmen and women of these Germanic invasions, and we must look to another great invasion for a clue. In 376, 2 centuries later, we are given an estimate of the number of Goth invaders by only one source, Eunapius, Universal History Fragment 42. Eunapius tells us that a single tribe of Goths, the Thuringi, numbered 200,000. It is unclear if this was the entire tribe, men, women and children, or just the warriors. If that number represents how many warriors were in a tribe, and tribes varied in size, then we get a very rough estimate that when the Marcomanni and Quadi invaded in 170, it was perhaps twice that number. The invasion of the Huns in the 5th century was said to number 500,000, Jordanus Getica 182. Again, it is unclear if this number was only warriors or everyone. There is much scepticism about these numbers, however, and we do not have to accept them at face value for the Marcomanni and Quadi. Whatever the number, there were enough barbarian tribesmen to outnumber, overwhelm, and outflank the Roman forces stationed to oppose them, and kill perhaps 20,000 Romans, and then move on to Aquileia and Opitergium. Some could have split off and made their way to Aquileia and Opitergium separately, especially if parts of their crossings were unopposed. The road from Germania via Pannonia into Italy was well known, since it was the amber route from the Baltic, well traversed since at least Nero's day. Pliny the Elder, Natural History 37.45-46. Ammianus's phrases "sudden swoops" and "bloody deeds performed in rapid campaigns" implies perhaps the presence of cavalry, although no other source goes into detail on the make-up of Germanic armies, and Germanic armies had always had large numbers of infantry, especially lightly armoured infantry, men who had been recruited as just such troops into Roman armies in centuries past. In which case we can envisage that large numbers of Marcomanni and Quadi crossed the Danube. Any men stationed at Carnuntum and Vindobona would have marched out to drive them back over the river, but they were overwhelmed, both in terms of numbers and also perhaps in the enemy's greater numbers of lighter troops who could outmaneuver the heavy Roman legionaries. This is precisely what was intended later in 172 at the battle on the ice, BO 7172.7. The idea of luring Roman forces to their doom was a barbarian tactic of long standing, and the image of Rome's legions being surrounded by superior numbers of more lightly armed enemy troops recurred during the Marcomannic and Sarmatian wars. There is some other information we can apply to the battle. It is unclear if Marcus made Carnuntum his base of operations in 170. It was, however, made his headquarters in 171, and would be used again as such at various points until 179. He wrote some parts of the Meditations there. This itself tells us that the fort itself was not targeted. If Carnuntum was the emperor's base in 170, then the defeat close by was more disastrous than any source lets on, and is one which they entirely suppress. It also makes Marcus's rapid recovery to have defeated the invasion before the end of the year all the more remarkable. The Roman response to the invasion by Balomar and the Marcomanni eventually came, however, most probably from Sirmium, modern-day Sremska Mitrovica, Serbia, on the Sava River, or from Signidunum, modern-day Belgrade, Serbia. Marcus had probably marched there, and his absence was taken advantage of by the Marcomanni, the Quadi, and their allies to take the opportunity to invade across the Danube. The loss at Carnuntum was Rome's greatest defeat in more than a century. Elliot 2020-108. Burley 1987-163, considered that it may have been Claudius Fronto, commanding multiple provinces in Dacia, who had success, and that it was Marcus's campaign which was disastrous. Claudius Fronto was, however, dead before the year was out, so must have met with disaster campaigning sooner, as his epitaph tells us. His grave but only names Germans and does not specify the Marcomanni or the Quadi. However, other possibilities for Marcus's headquarters exist. It could have been at Sirmium, Burley in Van Ackeren 2012-224, or on the Sava River, or even Signidunum. This was some 500 kilometres away from Carnuntum, and if this was where Marcus based himself, a site probably more likely, it might provide us with more of a comprehensible picture of the events of 170. Given the many delays in Marcus's actually marching to the front in 169-170 after the death of his brother and then son, it is probable that there had been large-scale raids over the river Danube in 169 and most of 170, as suggested by the summary in Dio. Perhaps as these proved so successful, and with no effective response forthcoming from Rome, even more tribes joined their cousins, giving them overwhelming numbers. These may have increased when Marcus marched from Rome towards Sirmium or Singidunum. If the defeat at Carnuntum, the siege at Aquileia, and the sacking of Opiturgium were roughly concurrent, it would have taken Marcus marching from Sirmium or Singidunum some time to respond and then march back to the locale of the crisis. We might surmise that these raids happened while he was still in Rome, and that one reason for his only grieving his son for 5 days was the urgency for him and his staff to get to the front. That he did this and was then able to force the tribes back towards the Danube and into negotiations seems to fit what the sources tell us. The only question is, how long did all of this take? Either option for Marcus's location, still at Rome or at Sirmium Signidunum, can be made to fit. The summary of Dio, which survives in the epitome made by John Xiphilinus in the 11th century, inexplicably glosses over the loss at Carnuntum, the siege of Aquileia, and the sacking of Opiturgium, giving us no details whatsoever, and it moves on very quickly to the subsequent successes of Marcus through his subordinates. Many of the Germans, too, from across the Danube, advanced as far as Italy and inflicted many injuries upon the Romans. They were in turn attacked by Marcus, who opposed them, his lieutenants Pompeianus and Pertinax, who later became emperor, greatly distinguished himself. Among the corpses of the barbarians there were found even women's bodies in armour. Dio 71-72.3.2. Xiphilinus here uses Celts and Rhine rather than Germans and Ister/Danube. The former was a common way of referring to Germanic tribes, and he was simply getting his river wrong. Our other sources use Ister, the usual name for the upper Danube. Many injuries is all that detail we get in this summary, and the focus is then on the recovery from disaster, although without ever admitting the disaster in the first place. We do not know how much more detail was in the original. We can note that this summary is not quite the same as the picture in Ammianus, where Marcus's victories were only achieved with difficulty. When Marcus defeated the Quadi in AD 172, the retribution campaign he embarked upon first, we seem to find mention of the fate of some of the men lost at Carnuntum. It would seem that at least some of the 20,000 men lost were in fact captured and taken prisoner, since in 172 the Quadi now offered to surrender all the deserters and the captives. Dio 71-72.3.11. These amounted to 13,000 men, and more were promised, and later all the others as well. These numbers might go some way to explain the loss of 20,000 men in Lucian. The SHA's life of Pertinax gives us more detail. Publius Helvius Pertinax would rise to be emperor briefly in 193, but was of the lowest of origins, perhaps even the son of a slave, before rising to be emperor after Commodus's death he had joined the army and risen to be a commander. The mention of him as a commander with Pompeianus by Dio 7172.3.2 implies that the passage in question, SHA Pertinax 2.1-4, also relates to the same period of Marcus's wars. It tells us that Pertinax served in the Parthian War and was then transferred to Britain, and from there commanded the German fleet. We can note that Pertinax's career and string of commands looks remarkably similar to that of other contemporary commanders promoted for their competence. He was then transferred to Dacia as procurator, deputy governor, where, through the machinations of certain persons, he came to be distrusted by Marcus and was removed from this post. 2.4. The circumstances of this was probably when the governor Calpurnius Agricola died, and when soon after Claudius Fronto took over Pertinax's command as well, Burley 1987-161. We are then told that afterwards, however, through the influence of Claudius Pompeianus, the son-in-law of Marcus, he was detailed to the command of detachments on the plea that he would become Pompeianus's aide. 2.4. Claudius Pompeianus had become Marcus's chief military adviser, originally from Syria, and of obscure origins. His father was not a senator, although as an equestrian he had risen to be the prefect of Egypt, personally appointed by the emperor. In 167, Pompeianus was the governor of Lower Pannonia. Despite being around 50 in AD 170, Marcus married him to his daughter, Lucilla, Lucius Verus's 19-year-old widow. Pompeianus then accompanied the emperor when Marcus left Rome for the front in autumn 170. We have the issue of coinage from the time with the Profectio, the emperor's official departure from Rome, and other coins show the Adlocutio, the emperor addressing his troops, the usual marker for the beginning of a campaign. Later in 170, very late in the campaigning season, or perhaps in early 171, would seem to be the occasion when Pompeianus and Pertinax are mentioned as commanding together in Dio, perhaps after the disaster at Carnuntum, and as part of Marcus's response to it. Pertinax's command of detachments, vexilis, at that time is also of interest. These would be vexillations of units drawn from other legions and perhaps auxiliary units, and given the manpower shortage which had led to the recruitment from diverse groups, perhaps some of these were now combined into an ad hoc command. It is possible that Pertinax's fall from grace was in some way connected with the disaster at Carnuntum or other concurrent invasions, but this is unclear. There was disruption in Dacia at the same time. A chieftain named Tarbus had taken the opportunity to invade Dacia, Dio 7172.3.11. Eliot 2020, 110, considered that the operations undertaken by Pertinax and Pompeianus did not take place until 171, time enough for Pertinax to be brought back into favour perhaps, and he may have continued in command until 174. He was rewarded with the command of Legio. 1. Adiutrix, which was in Marcus's army on the Danubian frontier, and SHA tells us that it was after this appointment that Pertinax straightway rescued Rhaetia and Noricum. This too was probably connected with the recovery after the defeat at Carnuntum. In 175, Pertinax was appointed as governor of 3 provinces, both Lycias and Dacia. Nonetheless, it is from Lucian where we get the best picture of the defeat. at Carnuntum, an account which is corroborated by later sources and suggested in the summaries of others. Although his account, nor any other, does not provide deployment or battle tactics, it nonetheless provides detail for a battle which was important at the outset of the wars, which would occupy Marcus Aurelius for the rest of his reign. The find of so many bodies of Roman casualties under a Vienna sports field offers remarkable insights into the brutality of Roman warfare. Most likely it is the defeat at Carnuntum in AD 170, which we can witness evidence of in the bodies beneath the Viennese soccer pitch. Thanks once again, Murray, for writing that episode for us. If you'd like to have a go at writing an episode for us, or you want to contact us and give us an idea for a subject that you think we've not covered yet, then just drop us a line, info@thehistorynetwork.org for that. And once again, please do consider becoming a patron of the podcast at patreon.com/thehistorynetwork. Once again, thank you to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. Thanks again for listening. You've been listening to the historynetwork.org podcast, written by Murray Dahm, read by Nick Barker.